If you were alive during the 90s or 2000 seconds, you surely remember that tune. It was the anthem of Intel, the world's most dominant chip maker, or at least they used to be. Since then, Intel has experienced a significant decline from its former glory. Or rather, they stagnated while everyone else surged ahead. Today, Intel barely ranks in the top 10 of the world's largest chip makers, trailing behind companies like Nvidia, TSMC, Broadcom, Samsung, ASML, AMD, Qualcomm, Applied Materials, and Texas Instruments. When you compare this to Nvidia's performance, Intel's situation looks even worse. Just 5 years ago, Nvidia was worth only half of Intel's valuation at around $80 billion. But now, you could subtract Intel's entire valuation from Nvidia's, and Nvidia would still be worth over $2 trillion. Intel isn't just underperforming in the chip industry. They are the worst performing stock on the S&P 500 right now. When you look at Intel's stock performance over the past 25 years, it's not surprising why. As of 2024, Intel still hasn't reached their all-time high from the year 2000 during the dot-com bubble. In fact, Intel is currently down 57% from that peak, and that's not even accounting for inflation. A dollar in 2000 is equivalent to $1.81 today, meaning the dollar has lost roughly 45% of its value. So Intel's stock isn't really at $31.36. In the context of their dot-com peak, it's actually at $17.3. In other words, Intel is down 77% in real value over the past 24 years. For the longest time, it was just Intel's stock that was underperforming. Fundamentally, the company's revenue and income were quite stable, but even that has changed recently. In just the past 2 years, Intel's revenue has plummeted from nearly $80 billion to $53 billion. As for net income, it's even worse. Intel went from netting $24 billion per year to losing billions in the modern world of AI supercomputers. So, what happened? How did Intel go from being the king of computer chips to struggling for relevance? Let's find out. If you're interested in deeper dives, interviews with insiders, and exclusive tech analysis, consider subscribing to our free weekly newsletter. But normally, you might feel bad after hearing such stories, especially if the outcome was completely unexpected. For example, the hospitality industry was devastated by the pandemic, and there was nothing they could have done to foresee such a catastrophic decline in tourism. It's easy to empathize with them. But when it comes to Intel, there was no catastrophic event or turning point. Rather, almost all of Intel's downfall can be explained by their own arrogance and complacency. But it wasn't always like this. Back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Intel was at the top of their game. You've probably heard of Moore's Law, the idea that the number of transistors in a chip doubles every 2 years. Well, Gordon Moore, the founder of Moore's Law, was also the founder of Intel, and as such, the company was always the biggest proponent of keeping the law alive and redefining what was possible. Engineers at Intel took immense pride in their work as they were the crown jewels of the company. But the importance of engineers slowly diminished at Intel throughout the 90s and especially in the 2000s. Why, you ask? Well, for the first time in chip history, branding mattered more than performance. Up until this point, virtually the entire chip industry catered to enterprise customers and PC enthusiasts whose main focus was price to performance. So, chip companies were highly incentivized to constantly improve their chips to stay ahead of the competition. But heading into the 2000s, we saw the rise of consumer PCs. The average consumer had little understanding of cores, hyper-threading, or clock speeds, but they did know one thing. Intel was the brand they trusted. In terms of performance, the branding of i3, i5, and i7 was all they needed to guide their buying decisions. Intel had effectively cornered the consumer PC market, and they began to prioritize marketing over engineering. The clearest evidence of this shift was in 2005 when they appointed Paul Otellini as their first non-technical CEO. Paul was a long-term sales and marketing executive, and the idea was that since Moore's Law was supposedly dying, Intel needed a marketing guy at the helm to keep growing the company. Now, to be fair, Paul actually did an excellent job given his task. He streamlined the company by conducting mass layoffs and focused all his efforts on sales and marketing, leading to landmark deals like the one with Apple for Macs. However, there was one tiny problem with this approach. Moore's Law wasn't actually dead, and with this new cutthroat corporate environment, Intel effectively alienated much of the engineering community. None of this really affected Intel's top or bottom line, though. Intel's branding and OEM partnerships were so strong that they weren't really punished for falling behind. Don't be fooled, though this was no indication of real strength. It was just a thin veil that gave Intel a good amount of slack. But this slack wouldn't last forever. Eventually, the rest of the industry would pull so far ahead that branding alone wasn't enough to overcome the performance gap. The first major blow for Intel was the launch of AMD Ryzen in 2017. Ryzen's top chips weren't necessarily better than Intel's, but when it came to everyday consumer chips, AMD's price to performance was leagues ahead. The second major blow for Intel came in 2020 when Apple decided to ditch Intel. Initially, people were somewhat skeptical of Apple making their own chips, but after seeing the performance, and more importantly, the insane efficiency of M1 chips, it was clear that the Emperor, Intel, had no clothes. And keep in mind, this wasn't just a bad generation for Intel. It was the result of decades of underinvestment and stagnation finally catching up. As much as Intel has fallen behind in the desktop industry, that only tells half the story. At the end of the day, Intel still controls about half of the desktop industry, and they still dominate the laptop market. This just goes to show how strong Intel's desktop branding and partnerships really are. But here's the thing that hasn't really saved Intel. Why? Well, because the consumer computer chip market is becoming an increasingly marginal part of the overall chip market. For starters, global computer shipments have been falling for over 10 years now. But even putting that aside, the chip industry has simply grown to be way larger than just computers. In fact, 4 major new sectors have developed over the past 20 years, and Intel missed out on every single one of them. The first sector is the smartphone industry, which doesn't even need much explanation. After the launch of the iPhone in 2007, smartphones exploded in popularity. TSMC, Samsung, and Qualcomm were fighting tooth and nail to win this market, while Intel wasn't even there. Moving on to sector number 2, we have the gaming industry. Ironically, this is an industry that Intel still controls to this day from a CPU perspective. But for some reason, Intel never took GPUs all that seriously, even though GPUs were the #1 piece of hardware that gamers spent money on. Even AMD was trying to compete in this market since 2006, despite being on the brink of bankruptcy. Yet, Intel didn't release their first discrete GPU until 2021, and even then, it was only for OEMs. The third sector is the cryptocurrency mining industry. This trend did wonders for Nvidia and was arguably the pivotal point at which Nvidia transitioned from being a niche gaming GPU maker to becoming a mainstream player. This was largely thanks to how much the crypto mining boom skewed the prices of GPUs. Fun fact, this channel was started by discussing how crypto mining was affecting gaming GPU prices. The hope was that after the mining boom cooled down, GPU prices would also cool off, but they never did. In fact, the exact opposite happened. Nvidia created a whole new sector of chips dedicated to maximizing mining performance, and once again, Intel was nowhere to be found. This brings us to the last and likely most crucial industry that Intel is missing out on as we speak, the AI industry. Now, to be fair, this is an industry that Intel is pursuing extremely seriously, but it's simply very difficult for them to compete. The reason Nvidia is so dominant in the AI industry is that they've gone through so many evolutions of GPUs, already from gaming GPUs to mining GPUs to data center GPUs. Nvidia has over 30 years of experience just making and evolving GPUs. So, for Intel to jump straight into the AI battle without any of this prior experience, well, let's just say it's an extremely difficult uphill battle. So, what happened to Intel? They got too comfortable, both in terms of advancing their chips and expanding into booming adjacent sectors. But there is a ray of hope. Over the past couple of years, Intel has been slowly addressing one issue after another, starting with their leadership. Paolo Tellini was obviously not the best choice for CEO, but neither were their next two choices. After Paul retired in 2012, Intel appointed Brian Kurzanich as the new CEO. Now, technically, Brian had an engineering degree, but he never really worked in engineering. He was a supply chain guy, just like Tim Cook, and he would eventually be forced out after having a relationship with an employee. The next CEO they brought in was a true MBA businessman and lifelong finance executive, Bob Swan. Needless to say, Bob didn't exactly get the company back on track, and Intel was getting a ton of hate at this point. Investors were frustrated that Intel's board was only appointing corporate yes men, and engineers were frustrated that Intel had turned into a marketing-first company. So in 2021, Intel finally made the bold decision to bring in Pat Gelsinger as CEO. Pat was a 30-year veteran of Intel and a true engineer, having worked his way up from design engineer to head of the digital enterprise group. His goal was to reshape the company back into an engineering-first company, and this really resonated with the public and the engineering community, giving Intel a ray of hope. Not long after Pat was brought on, Intel would also give up on several unproductive projects that were burning cash. The first project was Optane, which was supposed to be the future of memory. But after several years, Optane sales were minimal, and Intel's biggest customer for Optane chips was actually themselves. It was about time they gave up on the project. Another big project Intel gave up on was their self-driving division called Mobileye. In 2017, Intel bought this company for $15.3 billion, which was quite a large chunk of change even for Intel. However, instead of trying to aggressively grow Mobileye, Intel dragged their feet and made minimal progress. They did IPO Mobileye in 2022, but they still own 94% of the company, and their market cap has fallen to just $26 billion. Now, this may not sound that bad, but keep in mind, Intel had to invest $12 billion into the company after they bought it. So, their gain on the investment isn't much to brag about. However, as bad as things seem, these cost-cutting measures are the first steps towards a real turnaround. Intel is finally starting to bet big on fabs and data center chips. They're so serious that they've already announced that they plan to build the largest fab in the world, which will be in Germany. But with fabs costing $100 billion and taking up to 10 years to complete, this won't be an overnight turnaround. The same thing goes for their data center chips, which they're redesigning from the ground up. If you recall, Nvidia had a similar turnaround story during the crypto mining boom. But just because Nvidia succeeded doesn't mean Intel will. It's possible that they're simply too late to the AI boom, and it's also possible that all these cost-cutting measures and investments won't be enough to reverse the sentiment. This will be especially difficult considering that interest rates are likely going to be high for the next decade. Despite all this, though, at least it's nice to see Intel trying. Would you guys bet on Intel? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to stay updated on all our latest deep dives into tech companies and their fascinating histories.